Tonight, we uncover a secret so old, so carefully hidden, that even the Vatican forgot how to deny it. A mystery buried beneath cathedrals, sealed behind Latin prayers, and frozen in the silence of time. It begins not with saints or miracles, but with sailors, monks, and runes carved into stone, fragments of a history that was never supposed to survive. They say the church feared more than heresy, it feared memory. Somewhere beneath the marble floors of Rome lies evidence that Vikings once walked those halls, their voices echoing through corridors now drowned in candlelight. Letters speak of northern visitors granted private audiences. A chest marked with a single rune rests beneath St. Peter's Basilica. And in the deepest archive, sealed and unlisted, lies a catalogue of confiscated artifacts, labelled barbarian testimonies. The Vatican did not destroy them, it archived them, quietly, completely. But the truth has a way of leaking through cracks. A granite altar that did not come from Europe, a cross etched with runes found in the hands of a monk who vanished without trace, a map older than Columbus, showing coastlines no one in Christendom should have known, even a hymn that sings in code, its melody charting the path of the trade winds. Piece by piece, the fragments align, forming a story that stretches from the fjords of Iceland to the vaults of Rome, a story of knowledge shared, then erased. For centuries, the Vatican taught that the North brought only war and fire. Yet buried beneath its own silence lies another tale, one of scholars and sailors who carried not axes but understanding, men who read the stars like scripture, who saw God not in gold or marble, but in the wind and the sea. Their discoveries should have changed everything. Instead, they were hidden, buried under centuries of faith and fear. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Because tonight, we are not following legend, we are following evidence. And what it reveals is a truth the church tried to erase with ink and time. The Vikings may have reached farther than history allows, and the Vatican may have known it all along. These are the Viking secrets, buried beneath Vatican silence. They say history sleeps beneath marble and time, but sometimes it stirs, quietly, in the dust. It began with a single page, no larger than a hand, found in a forgotten drawer deep inside the Vatican library. Its parchment was pale, its ink brown and crumbling, but what it carried could fracture centuries of silence. Not scripture, not Latin hymns, but something older. Strange lines carved into the vellum, sharp, deliberate, alive, runes. Norse runes, sitting beside the handwriting of a Roman priest. The kind of pairing that should have been impossible. The librarian who found it didn't understand what he was holding. To him, it was just an anomaly, one of 1,000 curiosities buried in the archive. But when a visiting scholar from Denmark caught sight of the markings, he froze. Because those weren't random scratches, they were words, a message. And what it said changed everything. The note began with a date written in Latin numerals, the year 963, and a short phrase that read, "Visitors from the north have reached the holy shores." Below it, in rough runes, someone had etched, "The world is wider than they teach." At first, the scholar thought it was a joke, a monk's scribble made centuries later. But the ink was old, far older than it should have been. The carbon test confirmed it, 9th century. That meant the church had known about Norse sailors, not as raiders or legends, but as travellers, explorers, perhaps even guests. And if that was true, then the story of discovery, of who reached whom first, had been rewritten. In the days that followed, the fragment was locked away. The scholar was asked to leave. His access revoked without explanation. No one spoke of it again. Officially, it never existed. But stories have a way of surviving. Whispers travel faster than paper, and soon other clues began to surface. Mentions in old letters, a monk's travel log with half the pages missing, a seal bearing a rune beside a cross. It was as if a whole chapter of history had been hidden, not lost, buried beneath faith and fear. The Church had always claimed to be the keeper of truth, but what happens when that truth shows the world was never theirs to keep? Imagine it. Viking envoys walking through the marble halls of Rome, their furs brushing against robes of gold. Sailors who had crossed icy seas to stand before the same altar where emperors once prayed. Not as conquerors, but as equals, friends, maybe even teachers. That single page hinted at a meeting so profound it could rewrite how we understand both faith and exploration. But instead of celebrating it, the record was erased, hidden behind centuries of silence. Tonight, we open that silence. We follow the ink, the rune, the shadow of a truth the Vatican hoped would fade. Because sometimes, the smallest fragment can expose the greatest secret. And sometimes, the whisper of the North is loud enough to shake the walls of Rome itself. Deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where tourists never walk and light has not touched for centuries, there is said to be a door that opens to silence. Past the tombs of popes, past the catacombs that crumble into dust, lies a stone corridor known only to a few. Its walls sweat with age, its air heavy with incense and secrets. At the end of that corridor rests a sealed chest, untouched since the time when Rome feared the North. There are no golden symbols or holy inscriptions on its lid, only a single carved mark, a rune shaped like an F. The archivists call it the Letter of the Wanderers. To others, it is the mark of Freya, the old goddess of wisdom and memory. No one knows who carved it or when, but the chest has been mentioned in Vatican ledgers as early as the year 1120. The inventory calls it Testimonia Barbarica, the testimonies of the barbarians. But unlike other relics collected from distant lands, this one was never put on display, never studied, never opened, only stored, locked away with instructions that it must remain sealed until the Church itself commands otherwise. The few who have seen it describe it as simple oak reinforced with iron bands, darkened by age, bound by wax seals that carry the sign of the keys of St. Peter. But at its centre, burned into the wood, is that single rune, faint but defiant, like a voice trying to speak through the centuries. Some claim the chest was brought to Rome during the reign of Pope John XII, a time when stories of northern seafarers began to spread through Christian lands. Others say it arrived much later, smuggled into the archives by a monk who had travelled with missionaries to Iceland. Whatever its path, the box carries the weight of something the Church did not want to destroy, yet could not allow to be seen. There are whispers about its contents. Scrolls written in runes mixed with Latin, describing voyages far beyond what medieval maps allowed. Fragments of songs that tell of a meeting between Norse priests and Roman clerics. A broken piece of amber, carved with a cross that is also a compass. Some even believe it holds a letter from a Viking chieftain addressed to the Pope himself, offering friendship or perhaps warning. But no one can prove it, no one dares. The Vatican's archivists speak of the chest only in coded terms, as if naming it aloud could wake something better left asleep. Yet legends persist that once, during the late 1700s, the seals were nearly broken. A French scholar claimed he saw it opened for a moment during a secret examination of pagan artifacts. He said the air that escaped smelled of salt and ash, like the sea itself had been trapped inside. Then, without explanation, the chest was resealed. The scholar vanished weeks later. Maybe the rune was a name, maybe it was a warning. Either way, the chest beneath St. Peter still waits, patient and silent, holding the truth of an age when Rome met the North and chose to forget. In the year 1073, a quiet monk named Aidan arrived in Rome from the green hills of Ireland. He was small, pale, and soft-spoken, a scribe who preferred the company of ink and parchment to the noise of prayer halls. The Vatican assigned him to copy old texts from the northern missions, letters from priests who had travelled to the edges of the known world. But buried inside those reports were things Aidan was never supposed to understand. Strange symbols, short lines carved like the teeth of an ancient language. At first, the other monks called them marks of the devil, but Aidan had seen them before, carved into stones along the Irish coast, left by traders who came long before the cross reached their shores. He called them runes. Unlike his peers, Aidan could read some of them. He had learned from a hermit near Galway, an old man who claimed his ancestors came from the sea. The language fascinated him, and now, in the dim light of a Roman scriptoria, he saw it again, hidden among Christian prayers. One evening, while cataloguing a pile of damaged letters, Aidan found a diary written by a missionary who had served in Norway. In the margins, faint but clear, were notes in Younger Futhark, the rune system of the Viking age. The missionary's words spoke of visitors from the north who had come to Rome with gifts of carved ivory and strange maps. They were not treated as pagans or prisoners. They were escorted into private study rooms, away from the public eye. Aidan's curiosity grew into obsession. He began writing his own diary, recording every trace of these encounters he could find. He described meeting an old guard who remembered carrying sealed crates marked with Nordic symbols into the lower archives. He wrote about a procession at night, where tall, bearded men, wrapped in furs, were led past the altars of St. Peter, their faces lit by candlelight, their silence deeper than prayer. He claimed they were scholars, not warriors, sent to share knowledge of the stars, the seas, and the hidden lands across the Western Ocean, but something frightened him. In one entry, Aidan wrote, "They are kept not as guests, but as ghosts. The church learns, then buries what it learns." After that, his handwriting changed, shakier, hurried. The final pages of his diary speak of a warning that he had been told to stop asking questions. He mentions a meeting with a high cleric who ordered him to burn the texts containing runes. Aidan refused. The next day, his workroom was found empty. The diary survived only because another monk hid it behind a wall of manuscripts. It remained unseen until a restoration in the 1960s, when workers discovered it sealed in wax. The ink had faded, but the last line was still readable. The North spoke to Rome, and Rome answered with silence. No one knows what happened to Brother Aidan, but his words suggest the truth was written long ago, in a language the Church tried very hard to forget. In the dim vaults beneath the Vatican Library, there exists a list, written in a trembling Latin hand, cataloguing the strange and dangerous items taken from northern traders. Among relics and fragments of bone is one line that stands out. Crystalla ad gubernationem maris, crystals for the navigation of the sea. No description, no maker, only a warning written beside it. Do not expose to light during prayer. For centuries, no one paid attention. It was just another line in a dusty book, until a scientist in the early 1900s stumbled upon it while researching medieval optics. What she found made no sense. The entry was dated the year 1137, long before compasses were common in Europe. The report described a transparent stone that could locate the sun even on cloudy days, even when hidden beneath the horizon. The monks who documented it called it unnatural, a trick of demons, because it revealed the sun where there was only shadow. Today we know such a crystal exists. Iceland spar, a piece of calcite that polarizes light. Vikings called it a sunstone. By rotating it, they could find the direction of the sun with remarkable precision, allowing them to sail across fog and storm. But if the Vatican held one and labelled it confiscated, it meant they knew about it centuries before it appeared in science. The notes that survive speak in cautious reverence. The northern men, one line reads, bring stones that see through clouds, as if guided by the eyes of angels. Another says, they fear not the storm, for their crystal tells them where God hides. The Church could not accept such power belonging to pagans. If a stone could reveal what heaven concealed, it threatened the idea of divine mystery. So, the stones were seized, some were destroyed, a few, perhaps, locked away. There is an account of a monk who disobeyed the order and tried to use one inside a chapel. He wrote that the beam of light that passed through the stone fell perfectly upon the altar, illuminating the face of a carved lamb. He took it as a sign. The next day, the stone was taken from him, and he was transferred to a monastery in the Alps. He was never heard from again. The church's records mention objects of unnatural perception being sealed in the lower archives that same year. It is believed the sunstones are among them. If true, it would mean that medieval Rome held proof that the North possessed advanced navigation long before Europe's age of exploration, a piece of knowledge that could see through darkness, both literal and spiritual. Maybe that is why the catalogue entry still carries its warning: do not expose to light. Because once light touches truth, it can no longer be hidden. And somewhere in the Vatican, under centuries of silence, the sun still waits to shine through stone. In the Vatican's restricted archives, there is said to be a single parchment that should not exist. It is a partial portolan, a sailor's map, drawn in iron gall ink that has faded to the colour of smoke. The coordinates are written in a blend of Latin and Norse script, and its margins are filled with notes in two hands, one steady and trained, the other rough, perhaps written aboard a moving ship. What makes the map impossible is not its age, but what it shows. It traces the coastlines of Norway and Iceland with uncanny precision, following cold water currents across the North Atlantic to a wide landmass labelled in careful ink, Vinlandia. The name glows faintly, even after centuries, the letters pressed deep as if the writer wanted to make sure they were never forgotten. This would not be strange if the map were made after the year 1492, but the parchment was tested. It dates to the early 1200s, 200 years before Columbus ever sailed. The Vatican keeps the document under the category Apocrypha, the same label used for texts deemed heretical or false. Access is denied to all but a handful of curators, yet rumours of it have drifted through academic circles for decades. One scholar who claimed to have seen a photograph described faint ink lines running west from Iceland, intersecting tiny sketches of sea monsters and notes about fog, magnetic drift, and a place where the air smells of grapes. Another line, written in Latin, translates to "the men of the north reached it," and the priests marked it forbidden. The accuracy of the coastlines shocked experts. It matched the geography of Greenland and parts of Newfoundland. Whoever drew it not only knew of these lands, but understood the currents that connected them. The Church's reaction was silence. When the existence of the portolan was mentioned in a conference in Rome during the 1950s, the attending cardinal denied that such a map had ever been catalogued, but a later inventory list proved otherwise. The item number was real. The description was redacted. The rest of the list jumped from one entry to the next, as if the map had been erased by hand. Theories spread that the chart was copied from an older Norse source, perhaps brought to Rome by missionaries or envoys. Some believe it was drawn by a monk who had travelled with Viking traders and later tried to reconcile what he saw with the Church's vision of the world. If true, then the Vatican had evidence that Europe was not the first to reach the Western lands, only the first to claim them. The ocean did not separate the world, it connected it. But maps are powerful, they shape how people see. A coastline drawn in ink can rewrite an empire, and the Church understood that. So, the map was hidden, its edges trimmed, its origin silenced. Yet the faint mark of Vinlandia remains, carved into history like a whisper that refuses to fade, waiting for the day someone dares to unroll the truth again. There are stories that travel farther than the men who tell them. The Norse sagas were among them, carried by memory, firelight, and the wind off northern seas. But something strange happens when those stories pass through Rome. The voices change, the names shift, and voyages that once reached the edge of the world suddenly stop at safer shores. Scholars studying the medieval copies of the sagas have noticed that some versions written in Latin do not match their Icelandic originals. Gods have become saints. Wives of warriors have turned into virgins of faith. A voyage that clearly describes sailing west beyond Greenland ends mid-sentence, as if the sea itself swallowed the words. In one surviving text from the 13th century, the hero Leif is described not as the son of Eirík, but as Leo, servant of Christ. His ship's crossing becomes a mission, his discovery a pilgrimage. The mention of a fertile western land filled with vines and streams is replaced with a vision of paradise, as though the writer could not bear to let heaven exist on earth. The handwriting belongs to a Roman redactor, a scribe trained to align local legends with church doctrine. His edits are neat, almost invisible, but the gaps they leave behind are louder than any ink. In the margins of one copy, a faint note in Old Norse remains. It reads, "They took our gods and gave them robes." Another copy, preserved in the Vatican's Norse Codex collection, bears burn marks along its edges. The missing pages correspond to the chapters describing a voyage west of Greenland. Later notes by the archivist simply say, "removed by order of the council." It is believed the council referred to was held in the early 1300s, when the church sought to purify its records of pagan influence. But some evidence suggests the erasure began earlier. A correspondence between two monks from the monastery at Fulda mentions northern writings of dangerous implication. One monk warns that these texts suggest the ends of the earth are known to pagans and not to Christians. 2. Admit such a thing would have been unthinkable. It would mean revelation came not from the Holy Land, but from the frozen edge of the north. So, the sagas were rewritten. Over time, copies that contained the original voyages vanished. When later generations read them, the world seemed smaller. The sea became a barrier, not a bridge. Yet fragments survived. In Iceland, some oral versions persisted, carried by memory when ink failed. They spoke of land beyond the ice, of forests and rivers flowing into the sunset, of people who built homes where the stars tilted differently. Rome called them myths. The North called them truth. Today, when researchers compare the Vatican versions with those found in Reykjavik, they see the ghost of what was cut away. The erased voyage still echoes between the lines, a lost chapter that refuses to drown. Somewhere in those missing pages lies proof that the Norse reached farther than anyone dared to write, and that the Church's hand turned discovery into silence. In the archives of Monte Cassino lies a letter written by a trembling hand, dated the year 981. It was penned by a Benedictine missionary named Brother Lucian, sent north to spread the faith among the pagan clans. His words were meant for the eyes of the Pope, but what they describe feels less like a report and more like a confession. The letter begins with praise and obedience, but soon it drifts into fear. Lucian writes of a chieftain he met on the edge of the fjords, a man the locals called Eiríks the Star Reader. They said he could tell the hour by the colour of the sky, that he could find his way across open seas by watching how light danced on the waves. Lucian describes him not as savage, but as brilliant. He knows the heavens, the letter reads, as though he were born beneath them, and he speaks of them with the awe of a priest. The missionary admits he was drawn to him. Eiríks welcomed him into a hall of stone and driftwood, where torches burned with whale oil and the roof beams were carved with spirals of suns and serpents. There, hanging over the fire, Lucian saw something that silenced him. A wooden cross, carved with runes, not a mockery, but a merging. The chieftain told him it represented the same spirit the Christians spoke of, but in his tongue it had a different name. He said faith was not owned by any land, that truth travelled like the wind. Lucian asked if he wished to be baptized. Eiríks laughed, not in cruelty, but as one humoured by a child. "Why wash in water," he said, "when the stars have already seen me?" The missionary begged the Vatican to let him perform the rite anyway, to bring this man officially into the church. to show that the North could understand God without surrendering its soul, but the letter darkens. They told me, Lucian writes, that the chieftain's knowledge of the stars was forbidden, that no man of Christ may read the heavens as if they were scripture. He was ordered to abandon his mission and return. Yet he hesitated. He wrote one final paragraph, smudged and hurried. I fear I will disobey, it says, for I have seen his eyes follow the constellations, and they burn with something I have never seen in a bishop or a king. If God made the stars, why should their language be sin? The rest of the letter ends abruptly. A note added later, in a different hand, simply reads, Brother Lucian did not return. Some say he stayed with the chieftain, that he sailed with him west into the fog. Others claim he was executed for heresy. But the carved cross with runes was found years later in a monastery near Trondheim. Its wood was dark with age, its markings still sharp. It now rests in a sealed Vatican drawer, labelled Artifact of Uncertain Faith. Yet, to those who have seen it, it speaks of two worlds that met beneath the same sky, and a truth too vast to fit inside any one religion. In a hidden corner of the Vatican's ethnographic archive, there are records of fragile documents made not from parchment or vellum, but from birch bark. They were brought to Rome in the early 1300s by a group of Franciscan monks returning from the northern missions. The inventory describes them as pages of pagan instruction, their surfaces scarred by what the archivist called marks of the serpent language. To most who saw them, the symbols were nonsense. But to anyone familiar with the runes of the north, they spoke of something extraordinary. The birch bark codices were thin, water-warped and reddish, with stains that might have been ink or blood or both. When carefully unrolled, they revealed lines written in Younger Futhark, etched by a steady hand. The first few pages told of sea voyages, of frozen tides, and a mysterious current described as the warm river beneath the ice. The text explained how skilled navigators followed this hidden flow to reach lands where the sun lingers, though the night is long. Later translations suggest this could have referred to the Gulf Stream, an ocean current unknown to science for centuries. Another section spoke of a southern wind road, a route of mild air and steady waves that carried ships farther than any monk would dare to imagine. It read like poetry, but with the precision of a logbook. The monks who brought these codices hoped the church would see their value as records of geography and wonder. Instead, the response was swift and cold. The Vatican catalogue listed them under the title Itineraria Heretica, heretical itineraries. The reason was clear. The writings described the world as vast and continuous, with lands and peoples beyond the church's map. One passage even claimed that the sea is not the edge of the world, but its middle. To those who believed in a divine centre, such words were dangerous. A marginal note by a Roman scribe reads, "They speak of creation without Genesis." The codices were sealed away soon after, never translated officially, and their existence nearly forgotten. But in the 1920s, a Jesuit linguist rediscovered fragments of them while researching Arctic missions. He noted the strange accuracy of their directions and wondered how men from the 11th century could describe ocean currents that modern sailors had only begun to chart. Days later, his report was withdrawn. His notes disappeared. The birch bark fragments returned to silence. Yet, some whispers remain. A single piece of birch bark, now in a private collection, bears a small inscription in Latin added by a Vatican hand centuries later. It reads, "Knowledge travels with the heretic." The words beneath it, carved in faint runes, say, "We followed the wind south and found no wall." Whether metaphor or memory, the message is clear. Those who wrote on birch bark had seen beyond the frozen horizon, and the blood in their ink was the price of truth. In the heart of Rome stands a cathedral whose marble floor has puzzled architects for centuries. Tourists walk across it every day, without realizing what they are stepping on. A labyrinth of perfect symmetry spirals across the nave, its black and white stones forming a pattern of endless turns that lead to a small circle at the center. Most assume it is a symbol of pilgrimage or penance, a common motif in medieval churches. But one winter morning in the year 1971, a visiting astronomer noticed something strange. As the sun rose through the stained glass windows, a narrow beam of light touched the center of the labyrinth. It lingered for less than a minute before stretching into a long line across the floor. The line did not point east toward Jerusalem, as it should have. It pointed northwest, cutting across the cathedral like a secret map. When the astronomer followed its direction using a compass, the line extended toward a very specific destination, Iceland. At first, the discovery was dismissed as coincidence, but further study revealed details that could not be accidental. Beneath the main layer of marble, ground-penetrating scans revealed an older foundation. Embedded in the stone was a circular design of iron nails, arranged like the spokes of a compass rose. It predated the cathedral by at least 200 years. In the center of this hidden circle was a small cavity filled with volcanic ash. Testing showed that the ash did not come from Italy, but from a northern eruption in the 9th century, likely Icelandic in origin. Someone had built a compass beneath the house of God, and they had aligned it not with Holy Jerusalem, but with the distant homeland of the Vikings. The church never issued a statement. The team who made the discovery were asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement, citing security of heritage sites. But fragments of their research leaked years later. One document referred to the site as the Compass of the Pilgrims of the North. Another described how, on the spring and autumn equinox, the sunbeam crosses the same alignment, as if marking a solar pathway known only to its builders. Some believe the labyrinth was originally designed by monks who had travelled with Norse sailors, men who sought to merge their celestial knowledge with faith. They hid their compass beneath the symbol of devotion, disguising navigation as prayer. Perhaps they wanted to preserve what Rome was trying to erase, a memory of the northern connection. The Vatican has since sealed off the lower level of the cathedral, citing structural safety, yet local guides still whisper of a faint magnetic pull near the center of the labyrinth, as if the earth itself remembers its alignment. When the equinox sun strikes again, the light follows the same path it has traced for nearly 1,000 years. It does not bow east to Jerusalem, but stretches northwest across shadow and stone, reaching for the frozen land where faith and navigation once shared the same sky. Hidden deep within the Vatican's fiscal archives lies a book bound in dark calfskin, its cover worn smooth by centuries of silence. It is known only by a simple name written in faded ink along its spine, Liber Niger Mercatorum, the Black Ledger of Traders. Unlike other church records, filled with gold tallies and indulgence payments, this ledger lists something far stranger. Across its pages, written in the neat Latin of medieval clerks, are entries for tithes and offerings from a group described as Fratres Maris Septentrionalis, the Brethren of the North Sea. These accounts begin suddenly in the year 984 and continue for nearly 50 years before vanishing without explanation. The payments were not in coin. They came instead in ivory carved from walrus tusks, horn from narwhals mistaken for unicorns, and bundles of resin the scribes called sanguis navium, ship blood. Each shipment was carefully weighed and recorded, the items stored in sealed crates marked with a rune that looked like a branching tree. No one in Rome seemed to know where the resin came from. It was described as dark and sticky, with the scent of pine and salt. The traders said it was drawn from ocean forests far to the west, where the sea grew thick and the wind carried warmth even in winter. To the clerks, it sounded like heresy. How could forests exist in the open sea? Yet the resin burned with a clean blue flame and was prized for sealing ships. So the church accepted it. The Black Ledger shows that these traders paid their tithes not with fear, but with formality. Each entry ends with the same phrase, Pax Data, Fides Mane, peace given, faith remains. That alone suggests the Northmen were not outsiders begging favour. They were partners. Sometime around the year 1021, the ledger abruptly ends. The final line reads, "No further tribute, brethren vanished with the wind." Historians later assumed it referred to a lost coastal monastery or a group of converted Norse merchants. But one marginal note, written decades later, changes everything. In faded script, a scribe wrote, "Their captain came to Rome, bearing a map drawn on skin. He spoke of a land across the western water, where the trees bled pitch and the light lasted too long." The church never acknowledged this account publicly, but in the 19th century, a Jesuit scholar found traces of the same resin sealed inside a reliquary in St. John Lateran. Chemical testing showed it did not match any tree native to Europe. The archivists quietly relabeled the reliquary as "Origin Uncertain." The Black Ledger has since been locked away, unseen by the public, but whispers remain. Some believe the traders from the North Sea reached lands far beyond Greenland, trading not just goods but knowledge, and that the Vatican recorded every ounce of it. Perhaps that is why the ledger was bound in black, not for sin, but for secrecy, marking the moment when the Church accepted tithes from the edge of the known world and decided never to speak of them again. In a dusty vault beneath the Vatican Library, an illuminated manuscript rests behind glass, its pages alive with colour that refuses to fade. To most who see it, it is just another medieval gospel, filled with saints, angels, and scenes of divine teaching. But on one particular page, tucked in the margin like an afterthought, there is an image that should not exist. A bearded figure sits beside a stone well. He wears a robe of blue, a cloak trimmed in gold, and a halo crowns his head. His hand is raised in blessing, and around him kneel students holding scrolls. Yet one detail betrays him. His right eye is closed, the left stares sharply ahead, bright and knowing. Beneath the well, tiny lines of Latin read, Sanctus Severinus, Sapientiae Custos, Saint Severin, Keeper of Wisdom. But art historians who have studied this miniature see something else. The composition is almost identical to older Norse carvings of Odin at Mimir's well, where the god sacrificed his eye for wisdom. The well itself, the ravens in the corner, even the posture of the students match the pagan myth far too closely for coincidence. Someone, somewhere, took the story of Odin and dressed it in Christian paint. The manuscript's origin traces back to a scriptorium in the year 1102 at a monastery on the edge of the Rhine. The monks there were known for their skill in copying sacred texts, but they were also known for converting northern pagans. Perhaps one of them decided to merge the stories to make the faith more familiar. Or perhaps he was preserving something the Church wanted forgotten. The Vatican's own notes on the manuscript are cautious. In a report written in Latin, an archivist calls the figure anomalous in devotion. Another margin, added centuries later, simply says, "Eyes do not lie. The painting has layers of meaning beyond what meets the eye." The halo, when viewed under infrared light, shows a faint circle of runic etchings beneath the gold leaf. The runes spell a word, Wothas, an ancient name for Odin himself. Whoever painted it knew exactly what they were doing. For the Church, syncretism, blending faiths, was a tool. It made conversion easier. But sometimes the blending went too far. This image blurred the line between wisdom and heresy. The well became a baptismal font, the god became a saint, and the myth of sacrifice for knowledge became a sermon on divine grace. Still, something in the gaze of that one-eyed figure feels older than any gospel. The Church never banned the manuscript outright, but they moved it from public view. It now sits in a restricted collection, labelled the Severinus Codex, but among certain scholars it has another name. They call it Odin under a halo. It is a reminder that history is not always erased with fire. Sometimes it survives in the margins, disguised as faith, waiting for someone to notice that the saint who blesses the well is missing an eye and smiling like he knows a secret older than time itself. In the winter of 1956, a team of restoration experts in the Vatican Library uncovered something extraordinary. Inside a crate mislabeled as Coptic fragments, they found a small codex bound in sealskin, its spine cracked but intact. The pages were stiff with frost damage, and the ink shimmered faintly under light. It was written not in Greek, not in Latin, but in Old Norse. Its title, scrawled on the first page in red pigment, read Evangelium Arcticon, the Frozen Gospel. At first glance, it appeared to be a Christian text. It spoke of the end of the world, of a final battle between light and darkness, of a great trumpet that would shatter the heavens. The scribes assumed it was an obscure translation of Revelation, adapted for northern converts. But the deeper they read, the stranger it became. The sky split not with angels, but with fire serpents. The sea boiled. The stars fell, not as punishment, but as a renewal of the heavens. The sun was swallowed by a wolf. And yet the text ended in light, with the return of peace and green life after the fire. To anyone familiar with Norse mythology, it was clear. This was Ragnarok retold, rewritten through the language of the Bible. Someone had taken the ancient prophecy of the god's twilight and disguised it as scripture. The frozen gospel spoke of Christ not as a redeemer, but as the reborn Sunday. The dragon became the serpent, Jormungandr, renamed as Leviathan. Even the archangel Michael bore a striking resemblance to Thor, the protector of mankind. What made the codex more mysterious were the diagrams in its margins. Circles divided into 12 parts, lines connecting stars, tables marking the cycles of the aurora borealis. It was as if the author used the apocalypse as a secret star map, hiding astronomy beneath theology. Scholars now believe it was written in the 11th century by a Norse monk trained in a Coptic monastery, perhaps in the eastern Mediterranean. He would have learned both Christian symbolism and the old myths of his homeland, merging them to preserve forbidden knowledge. When the Church began censoring texts that mixed pagan and biblical ideas, copies of the frozen gospel vanished. Only this one survived, frozen in a monastery near Trondheim until rediscovered centuries later. The Vatican catalogue quietly filed it away as cosmological apocrypha, language undeciphered. But those who have studied its symbols say it contains something deeper. The diagrams match real astronomical events, star patterns that appear only every 1,000 years. One passage describes the aurora as the breath of heaven returned, perhaps the earliest record of the northern lights seen as a divine cycle. To the Church, it was blasphemy. To the author, it was truth disguised as faith. The frozen gospel turned prophecy into preservation, scripture into science. It showed that even as one world ended, another was waiting to begin. Somewhere between Revelation and Ragnarok, a monk hid a map of the stars and called it holy, knowing it was the only way his truth would survive the cold hands of time. In the year 1467, a cartographer named Matteo de' Rossi lay dying in a small hospice outside Florence. He was not famous, though his maps had guided sailors across half the known world. For decades, he had worked in service to bishops and princes, drawing coastlines with perfect precision, turning whispers of distant lands into ink and parchment. But in his final days, he began to speak of things no one had ever heard him mention before. The confessor assigned to his bedside, Father Giacomo, recorded his words carefully in Latin, later sealing them in the Vatican's cartographic archive. The notes were forgotten until they were rediscovered centuries later under the title Confessio Geographiae, the cartographer's confession. In it, Matteo claimed that many of his maps, the ones praised for their accuracy of northern seas, were not his own inventions. He said they came from men of the Whale Road, sailors from a world beyond Rome's reach. They were not merchants, he said, but monks, men with shaved crowns who still spoke with the accents of the north. They arrived quietly, never in fleets, but in pairs, bringing with them pieces of animal hide etched with strange lines. The hide was not cow or goat, but something thicker, oiled and tough like seal skin. On these scraps were coastlines unknown to the church. One showed a jagged edge of land beyond Greenland, another a narrow passage through ice. The men told Matteo they had once been warriors, but had traded longhouses for cloisters to protect what they called the sea roads. If Rome finds them, they told him, they will pave them with power. Matteo swore to keep their secret, but as he grew older, his conscience began to burn. He feared that by hiding the truth, he had betrayed his oath as a servant of God. Yet, he also feared that revealing it would bring ruin to those who had trusted him. His confession flickers between guilt and wonder. They spoke of stars like brothers, he wrote. They knew the sky as one reads scripture, and their compasses were crystals that bent the light. He described their knowledge of the tides, how they spoke of a warm current that wrapped around the cold seas like a serpent. He said their leader, a silent man missing one eye, carried a carved cross marked with runes. When Matteo asked who taught them, the man only smiled and said, "The sea remembers." The confession ends abruptly. Father Giacomo's final note reads, "He died with peace in his eyes, whispering, 'Do not let them draw the sea into their maps.'" The Vatican never published the document. To admit that Norse monks had once sailed farther than Rome allowed would mean rewriting centuries of history. But in the margins of Matteo's original map of the North Sea, there is a faint engraving barely visible under light. It shows a compass rose with runic letters, and beside it, a single phrase in Latin, "Via maris liber est." The sea road is free. In the archives of the Vatican Observatory, there is a collection of weather journals that span more than 400 years. They record eclipses, comets, and the movements of stars. But one set of notes stands apart. They are dated to the year 1692, written by Father Lorenzo Bellini, a Jesuit astronomer in service to the Holy See. His entries are elegant and detailed, describing a strange glow that appeared above the horizon during the depths of winter. He called it a celestial crown, a ring of light that moved like a living flame. We know today that he was describing the aurora borealis, the northern lights, seen unusually far south, but among his careful observations there are markings that do not belong to him. Small runes have been drawn beside nearly every mention of the lights, carved into the margins by another hand. The handwriting belongs to his assistant, a young scholar named Thomas Alvar. The marks were subtle at first, ignored by later readers, but under magnification they form a pattern. Each rune corresponds to a direction, a compass point, as if Thomas was mapping the sky itself. In one entry, Bellini writes, "The boy insists the lights are not random, but language. I have reprimanded him for pagan fancy." A few pages later, his tone changes. He claims the crowns follow a rhythm of 9 nights, and he is correct. I am troubled by this. By the spring of that year, the notes grow uneasy. Bellini describes hearing whispers among the staff that his assistant is consulting forbidden texts, comparing the lights to old northern prophecies. One morning, Thomas was found in the observatory tower before dawn, tracing runes across the telescope lens with ash. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "The sky speaks in the tongue of Odin, and I only write what it says." He was dismissed the same week. The church ordered his materials confiscated and his name erased from the records. Bellini continued his work, but his later entries are heavy with guilt. "He knew something I did not," he wrote. "The sun at midnight is not a miracle, but a message." Modern astronomers who have reviewed the surviving pages noticed something remarkable. The auroral patterns Thomas marked correspond to magnetic activity recorded in polar ice cores centuries later. He had somehow recognized the rhythm of solar storms long before anyone understood the science behind them. His rune for light matches the shape of a modern polar chart. The Vatican never acknowledged his contribution. His name appears only once more in a disciplinary ledger marked Heretic Sympathizer. But there is a rumour among observatory staff that one of his pages still exists, hidden behind a false panel in the old telescope room. It is said to contain the drawing of a northern crown made entirely of light, the sun shining at midnight, with a single line beneath it written in Norse. It translates simply to, "Heaven remembers the North." In the year 1212, a deposition was sealed within the Vatican's legal archives, its pages marked confidential by papal decree. It told the story of a Norman knight named Sir Eiríks de Beaumont, once sworn to the Templar Order, who was accused of treason against both church and crown. The testimony came from sailors, monks, and a frightened scribe who claimed to have seen Eiríks consorting with northern men at a hidden harbour. The document begins like a confession, but reads more like a map of silence. It describes a place known only as the Quay Beyond the Fog, a harbour that did not appear on any royal chart. The witnesses said ships arrived there without heraldry, built long and narrow like serpents, with carved dragon heads wrapped in linen. Their crews were not crusaders or merchants. They were Norse pilots, pale-haired men who spoke little Latin but carried letters sealed with the red cross of the Templars. Alaric met them at night, trading barrels of wine and salt for something no one recognized. Wooden chests lined with pitch and filled with tools of strange design, metal compasses unlike any made in Europe, and scrolls written in both runes and Greek. When questioned, Alaric claimed the Norsemen were allies who came from lands the Pope does not name. He said they sought provisions for a voyage across an ocean of fog to a place they called the New Shore. The inquisitors pressed him to explain where this new shore lay. He answered only, "Farther west than the maps of kings dare to go." That was enough to condemn him. The Vatican ordered the harbour destroyed and the testimony sealed forever. But parts of the story survived in the margins of shipping records. An unsigned ledger from the same year lists supplies purchased for a fleet that never appeared in any royal report: timber, tar, grain, and crucifixes for 7 ships. The list ends abruptly with the note, "For those who sail without witness." Centuries later, a team of French historians studying the Templar trials found references to a northern alliance, a pact between Norman knights and Norse navigators. They believed it was an attempt to rediscover a trade route once known only to Viking mariners, one that reached beyond Greenland into a western ocean. The Quay Beyond the Fog may have been their meeting point, hidden somewhere along the Breton coast, destroyed after the fall of the Templars in 1312. A map fragment discovered in a monastery near Rouen shows an inlet marked with a rune for safe harbour, but its coordinates were erased. Some say the church feared what the Templars had learned, that they had proof of another world waiting beyond the Atlantic. Others believe Alaric de Beaumont never betrayed his order at all. He was only trying to keep an ancient secret from becoming a conquest. The deposition ends with his final words before execution, written in trembling ink: "The sea will tell them nothing. The fog guards its own." In a small chapel on the outskirts of Lisbon stands an altar unlike any other in Europe. Its surface is rough, grey, and flecked with black crystals, not the polished marble favoured by Roman craftsmen. For centuries, the priests who served there believed it to be a relic of the Crusades, brought from a distant mission and blessed by time. But in the year 1948, during restoration work, a geologist examining the stone made a quiet discovery. The granite was not from any European quarry. Its mineral composition matched a type found only along the North American coast. When the Vatican heard of the finding, the stone was quickly removed and replaced without explanation. The original now rests in the archives beneath St. John Lateran. labelled only as altere de origine incerta, altar of uncertain origin. Beneath its base, embedded deep in the stone, conservators found something even stranger. A small token made of silver, shaped like a cross yet carved with faint runes along its arms. The edges were worn smooth, as though rubbed by many hands in prayer, and traces of salt lingered within the grooves. The inscription, when translated, read, "For the God who walks both sky and sea." Scholars who examined it quietly began to call it the Vinland Eucharist. The theory was simple and terrifying. If the altar and token were authentic, they could be proof that Norse Christians celebrated Mass across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. According to one early church record, a group of northern brothers reached a distant shore where they built a stone table and sanctified it with seawater. The passage was dismissed as allegory, yet it matched the description of the Lisbon altar exactly. The Vatican's own report, now classified, stated that the granite contained microscopic sea fossils from a coastline far to the west of Greenland. No one could explain how such a stone reached Europe before the 15th century. One possibility is that it was brought back by returning Norse monks who fled the collapse of their settlements, carrying with them their altar stone as both relic and proof of faith. Others believe it was retrieved by Templar explorers who found remnants of their voyages in a forgotten land. Whatever its journey, the rune cross token inside it tells a story of devotion that defied continents. The carvings combine Christian symbols with the Norse mark for protection. Together, they form a single message, the merging of two worlds, one of spirit and one of sea. The Church has since downplayed the discovery, insisting the stone's origin remains geologically uncertain. But those who saw it say its weight felt different, as if it carried the silence of an ocean still unspoken. The altar now displayed in the chapel is a perfect replica, polished and flawless, but it lacks the chill of the original. Somewhere beneath Rome, the true Vinland Eucharist lies sealed in the dark, its rune cross still whispering of prayers spoken under northern stars. When faith crossed the Atlantic, long before history dared to follow, in the frozen ruins of Gardar, the old bishop's seat of Greenland, history ends without warning. The parish rolls, once filled with baptisms, marriages, and burials, stop suddenly in the year 1461. One entry marks the last recorded Mass, written in Latin by a trembling hand. After that, the ink falls silent. No note of famine, no mention of plague, just absence. When later explorers rediscovered the site, they found crumbling stone walls, a broken bell, and graves covered in moss. The church called it abandonment, a retreat forced by cold and isolation. But deep in the Vatican's archives, there is a short memo that suggests otherwise. It bears the seal of the Curia and the date 1463. The message is brief and cold. No inquiry is to be made into the matter of Gardar. Seasonal relocation has been approved, further communication unnecessary. There is no follow-up, no list of survivors, no attempt to reclaim the diocese. The official silence is deafening, yet in the margin of that same memo, someone, perhaps a clerk bored or nervous, doodled a small sketch, a longship, its sail unfurled, heading west. The drawing seems careless, but the detail is haunting. The ship carries a cross at its masthead, and what looks like a bishop's mitre on the prow. It is as if the artist knew something unsaid, that the flock did not vanish but sailed away. Later records from Iceland mention a rumour of the lost Christians of Greenland, settlers who left quietly one spring and never returned. Some said they sailed toward a land where the winters were soft, a place beyond the fog. The Vatican dismissed these tales as myth, but fragments of letters from traders in Bristol and Trondheim hint that ships with unfamiliar symbols were sighted far out at sea around that same decade. One letter describes a vessel built of northern oak, bearing priests who sought the sunset. For years, historians debated what became of them. Climate change, starvation, or simply despair were common answers, but none explain the Vatican's decision to forbid investigation. Why close the books so completely, unless there was something worth hiding? Some believe Gardar was not abandoned at all, but evacuated with purpose. Perhaps the priests knew of the western lands spoken of in Norse legend, and chose faith over obedience, following the old sea routes once drawn by Viking hands. The last bishop of Greenland, Arnold of Gardar, was ordered to return to Norway, but never arrived. His name appears nowhere after 1450. In the Vatican roll of deceased clergy, his entry is blank, not dead, not alive, just missing. When archaeologists excavated the ruins centuries later, they found no valuables, no sacred vessels, nothing to loot. The altars were stripped clean, as though the people had taken their church with them. The silence of Greenland is not just the silence of ice. It is the silence of departure, of a people who carried their faith west into mystery, leaving behind only a doodle in the margin, a small ship sailing forever toward the edge of the world. In a quiet corner of the Vatican's philological library, there is a table stacked with parchment copies of medieval Norse sagas. Next to them, another stack holds Latin manuscripts of early saints' lives. At first glance, the two collections seem unrelated, different worlds of story and faith. But when scholars began comparing them line by line, they discovered something unsettling. Whole chapters of the sagas had been rewritten and hidden inside the hagiographies, the Church's official stories of holy men. The same events, the same landscapes, the same heroes, but with new names and divine motives. Battles became miracles. Voyages turned into pilgrimages. Gods became saints. A warlord who fought beneath the northern lights was now a bishop who converted pagans by torchlight. In one saga, a hero named Hrafn sailed west through ice and thunder to bring back the light of the new world. In its Latin twin, the same journey appears as the story of Saint Marinus, who crosses a stormy sea to deliver relics to an island of light. Even the weather is identical, only the purpose has changed. The Church had not erased the sagas, it had baptized them. This rewriting began in the 13th century, when papal envoys travelled north to ensure that the newly Christian lands aligned their stories with Rome. They ordered monks to translate the old tales, but to purify them first. Anything that hinted at the old gods, at sorcery, or independent cosmology was to be altered or removed. The results were elegant acts of censorship. In one manuscript from Trondheim, a battle against frost giants became a struggle against the cold of unbelief. A sun chariot drawn across the sky turned into the triumph of divine light. Coastlines, once mapped with precision, were blurred into metaphors of grade. Faith, their names replaced with Isle of Revelation or Sea of Grace. The old world faded beneath allegory, yet traces of truth survived between the lines. A monk copying one of these altered tales left a small note in the margin. These men were not saints but sailors. Another wrote, "We translate fire into faith, frost into sin." His words were later crossed out, but not fully erased. When modern translators compared the original Icelandic texts with the Vatican versions, the pattern became undeniable. The sagas had been folded into Christianity so completely that the world forgot where one ended and the other began. What was once myth became sermon, and the real voyages, the daring journeys into unknown seas, were reduced to symbols of devotion. Perhaps the Church believed it was saving souls by reshaping these stories. Or perhaps it feared what they revealed, that faith and discovery were never separate, and that the North had seen divine light in its own way long before Rome. The edited sagas remind us that history can be rewritten not by sword or fire, but by ink. Fire and frost, once forces of nature and legend, were turned into metaphors to serve a single truth. But the old meaning still burns faintly beneath the words, waiting for those who know how to read what was never meant to be forgotten. In the spring of 1982, a letter arrived at the Vatican's Department of Natural Antiquities from a physicist at the University of Copenhagen. His name was Dr. Henrik Dahl, and his request was simple. He asked permission to examine a crystal fragment stored in the archives and labelled Specimen 473 amperes, Iceland Spar, provenance unknown. The fragment had been catalogued in the late 1700s, believed to have been seized from a northern trader by church officials who mistook it for a pagan relic. Dr. Dahl explained that Iceland spar, a transparent form of calcite, could polarize light and had once been used by Viking navigators to locate the sun on cloudy days. The Vatican granted him access, setting a date for the study that June. 3 weeks later, the approval was revoked without explanation. When Dahl asked why, he received a brief reply. The specimen has been reassigned to restricted classification. Still determined, he travelled to Rome at his own expense, carrying letters from the Danish government and multiple universities. At first, the archivists refused to meet him, but eventually, one young curator agreed to show him the record. The catalogue entry was there, listing the stone as confiscated material, suspected of occult utility. Its dimensions matched those of known navigation crystals, but where the location of the specimen should have been, there was a blank space. Dahl insisted it must still exist somewhere in storage. The curator hesitated, then whispered that it had been examined once before, in 1957, by a Jesuit optical researcher who had claimed the crystal bent sunlight even indoors. His experiment was halted, and the stone was removed from his care. Later that night, Dahl wrote in his travel diary that he felt watched. He described hearing footsteps in the corridor outside his guest room in the archive's residence wing. 2 days later, he returned home without the stone, promising to publish his findings anyway. 6 months passed, and then the archives received another letter, this time from the Vatican itself, confirming the specimen's permanent withdrawal. In its place was filed a single sheet of paper. On it was written, "Returned to myth. No signature, no seal." Dr. Dahl continued to search for proof that the crystal had existed, but every reference vanished from the official index. Even microfilm copies of the catalogue page had been altered. When he tried to speak about it publicly in 1984, his university suspended him for academic misconduct. He died 2 years later, his notes confiscated by the authorities. What remains is a handful of letters and one photograph showing a small, translucent stone resting on velvet inside a glass case. Its edges glow faintly, as if holding trapped sunlight. The Vatican has never acknowledged the photograph as authentic, but the handwriting on the label matches the old catalogue exactly. Some believe the Church destroyed the sample to maintain the idea that divine guidance comes only from heaven, not from a piece of crystal in a sailor's hand. Others think it still lies hidden, its light sealed away, because sometimes the truth is too clear to look at directly. They say roads are made by empires, but some paths are older than empire itself. Across Europe, there exists a line of stones that stretches like a scar through history, beginning in Rome and ending in the windswept fields of Iceland. Each stone is carved with runes, faint and weathered, yet too deliberate to be random. Archaeologists have found them embedded in church walls, buried beneath cathedrals, and hidden in monastery courtyards. When traced on a map, their placement forms a perfect arc northward, a path scholars now call the Polar Corridor. The first known stone lies beneath the cobblestones near St. Peter's Square, unearthed during maintenance work in 1969. It bears a single rune, the symbol for journey. The discovery was quietly covered, the stone replaced before the public could see it. The second was found near the old Benedictine monastery of Cluny, France, carved into the foundation of a wall. The same symbol appears there, but this time accompanied by a second rune meaning light. From there, the trail continues north to Ribe in Denmark, where a church cornerstone contains an identical pair arranged like the points of a compass. Someone, centuries ago, had marked a hidden route, as if charting a spiritual highway connecting the heart of Christendom to the edge of the Arctic world. The Church never acknowledged these findings, though local legends persist of a pilgrim's line walked only by those carrying sacred knowledge. In the archives of Uppsala, a letter dated 1272 describes a group of monks travelling from Rome to the far north to seek the wisdom of the midnight Sunday. The writer mentions their path being marked by stones of God's alphabet. He was likely referring to the runes. But why would the Vatican authorize such a journey? Some historians believe the stones trace an ancient exchange of ideas, a hidden alliance between scholars of faith and the Norse keepers of celestial lore. Others suggest it was a secret courier line for transporting forbidden manuscripts, texts too dangerous for official channels. A fragment of parchment found in Iceland's Skalholt monastery supports this. It lists a sequence of cities matching the locations of the runestones, ending with the phrase, "Knowledge flows north." The Icelandic stone, the final marker, stands near Reykjavik, half buried in volcanic soil. When the midnight sun touches its surface, a line of light runs through its grooves, pointing directly back toward Rome. Scientists tested its orientation and confirmed that the alignment is precise, following the curvature of the Earth almost exactly. Such accuracy would have required advanced astronomical skill, far beyond what was known in the 12th century. The Vatican's official stance remains silence, but among the archivists, a rumour persists that the Polar Corridor was a knowledge route never canonized, a secret pilgrimage for those who sought God in the stars as much as in Scripture. Each stone a breadcrumb, each rune a whisper, guiding those who dared to follow the northern light. In a forgotten drawer of the Vatican's music archive lies a thin parchment bound in leather, catalogued simply as Cantus Maris, the Song of the Sea. To the untrained eye, it is a medieval hymn, like countless others, a chant written in neumes, the early form of musical notation used before modern scales. But something about it feels strange. The melody is unusually wide, its intervals sharp and deliberate, repeating in long, sweeping patterns that seem less about worship and more about direction. When a Jesuit musicologist rediscovered it in the year 1954, he noticed that each shift in pitch corresponded to a numerical pattern. When converted to degrees, the intervals matched specific latitudes. The song, it seemed, was not just music, it was a map. The parchment's margin contains a faded note in Latin, Cantatur semel in anno subvento occidentali, sung once a year under the western wind. The line hinted at ritual, but also at navigation. In the Middle Ages, sailors and monks often sang to measure time and rhythm at sea, but this hymn was different. It began with tones that mirrored the latitude of Rome, then moved progressively northwest through intervals aligning with the coasts of France, Ireland, and Iceland. The final haunting chord marked a latitude near 51 degrees north, exactly where the Gulf Stream curves toward Newfoundland. The hymn was a great circle path, hidden in plain sound. The researcher who made this discovery, Father Anselmo Costa, proposed that it might have been sung by crews trained by northern monks, using music to encode a voyage. The church refused to publish his paper, calling it speculative and unhelpful to theology. Yet Father Costa's notebook survives, filled with transcriptions showing the correlation between the notes and geographic positions. He wrote, "The melody follows the wind. It is not prayer, it is travel." The Vatican later reclassified the manuscript as liturgical experiment, region unknown. But beneath the faded ink, ultraviolet scans revealed something else. Tiny runic symbols etched along the cleft lines, almost invisible to the naked eye. Each rune represented a compass direction. Together they spelled a phrase meaning, "the path of the west wind." The implication was clear. The hymn was a navigational chant designed for those who crossed the Atlantic, a way to remember the rhythm of currents and trade winds when maps could not be trusted. Some accounts from medieval seafaring monks speak of singing the sea open, where hymns were believed to calm storms and guide ships. Perhaps this song was their code, half faith, half mathematics. When the melody was played through modern software, the frequency of its repeating intervals matched the pattern of ocean waves recorded along the same route. The sea and the music seemed to share a heartbeat. No one knows who composed the hymn or why it was hidden among the church's sacred works, but its beauty lies in its disguise, a song of worship that was also a map, a choir that followed the wind. Somewhere between prayer and calculation, the sea once sang back, carrying voices westward toward a land still waiting to be named. In the year 1189, a letter arrived in Rome from the remote Norse monastery of Helgafell, a lonely stone refuge perched above Iceland's western fjords. It was addressed to the Abbot General of the Benedictine Order, written by a man who signed his name Brother Stymir. The letter was brief, its tone both reverent and heavy with farewell. It spoke of a final voyage and of a group of men who called themselves the brothers of both books. They were monks and sailors, keepers of the Bible and the Rune, men who believed that divine truth could not be contained within one language alone. The abbot wrote that after years of prayer and debate, they had decided to leave their monastery forever. Their destination was west, toward what they called the wine-dark dawn, a place described in both their scripture and their sagas. He described how the brothers spent months building a great gnar, the broad-bellied trading ship used by Norse navigators. Its hull was sealed with pitch mixed from pine and whale oil, its mast carved with a cross that bore the faint outline of runes for wind and protection. They called the vessel Solheimer, the home of the Sunday. Stymir wrote that he had blessed the ship with water from the monastery's font and fire from the hearth, merging the rites of Rome and the rituals of the north. On the morning of their departure, the sky was grey and the air still. He wrote that the sea lay flat as glass, reflecting the clouds like silver. The monks sang the old Latin hymn Lux Aeterna, their voices rising and falling with the tide. Then one of them, Brother Hallvard, began to hum a tune older than Christianity itself, a melody of runes and rhythm once sung to guide ships through mist. The two songs blended into one, and Styrmir said he felt as if heaven itself listened. As the ship slipped from the shore, the brothers turned not east toward Europe, but west, following the setting Sunday. Styrmir ended his letter with a line that chilled those who read it. They go to seek the garden of God that lies beyond the ice. The letter was carried to Rome by a merchant ship and archived in the papal library. Months later, a request was sent back to Helgafell, asking for news of the voyages. No reply ever came. The monastery's later records make no mention of the brothers or their ship. By the time new monks arrived a century later, the site was abandoned, its chapel roof collapsed, its altars covered in moss. The Solheimer and its crew vanished into legend. Some claim they reached the coast of Vinland and built a small chapel of driftwood and stone before winter swallowed them. Others say they were swallowed by the sea itself, carried into the realm of the aurora where the sun never truly sets. But one thing remains certain. The brothers of both books believed that truth could float between worlds, between faiths, between shores. And somewhere beneath the waves, their ship still sails west into the eternal dawn, carrying a gospel written in light and salt. Beneath the marble corridors of the Vatican Apostolic Archive lies a section that does not appear on any official floor plan. It is known only to a handful of curators, and referenced in internal correspondence as the Northern Annex. Most archivists will tell you it is a climate-controlled storage space for deteriorating vellum, but those who have worked there whisper another name, the Room of the Keeper. The man who tends it is listed in payroll records simply as Custodian of Northern Matters. His real name has never been made public. He occupies a small office with no windows and a single wooden door that leads to a vault without number. To enter requires 2 keys turned at the same time, one held by the custodian, the other by the prefect of the archives. The air inside the vault is dry and cold, carrying the faint scent of iron and sea salt. The shelves hold not the usual manuscripts of popes and cardinals, but sealed boxes marked with runes, maps drawn on animal hide, and fragments of birch bark bound with wax. Each item bears a catalogue number that begins with the letter F, though no one can say what the letter stands for. Some claim it means fratres, the brethren. Others say it marks the word Fimble, the old northern name for the endless winter. Whatever the truth, the custodian works alone. He is said to live within the archive itself, sleeping in a narrow chamber between the stacks. His duty is to monitor humidity, temperature, and silence. Above all, silence. Every 10 years he is replaced, but before each new custodian assumes the role, he must take an oath written in Latin and Old Norse. The vow binds him to secrecy and to something far stranger, to forget what he has seen once his service ends. Former custodians are relocated to distant monasteries or small parish offices. None of them have ever spoken of their work again. One former archivist described seeing the current keeper during a midnight inspection in the year 1973. He was an elderly man with pale eyes, wearing gloves and a key around his neck. When asked what the room contained, he smiled and replied, "The memory of what the church chose not to remember." A report later surfaced, describing a restricted collection labelled De Septentrione of the North. It contained the remnants of documents from Greenland, Iceland, and even fragments from Vinland, all sealed under papal order centuries ago. The keeper's task was to guard them, not to read them, ensuring they neither decayed nor resurfaced. Some believe the two keys are symbolic, one for knowledge and one for forgetting, and that turning both means balancing truth with silence. The custodian of Northern Matters has no recorded date of appointment, only a note written in red ink beside his entry. It reads, "He serves until memory fades." And so the vault remains locked, waiting beneath the Vatican, holding the evidence of worlds that met long before history admitted they could. In the summer of 2014, a glacier in southern Iceland cracked open after centuries of stillness. From the meltwater emerged a small dark shape, folded and stiff like bark from another world. When archaeologists unrolled it under glass, they found faint carvings running across its surface. It was birch bark, etched with runes and lines of Latin. The scientists who studied it realized they were holding the final piece of a forgotten story, a voice frozen in silence for 1,000 years. The inscription began with a greeting, "To the brothers of the south, from those who have seen beyond the fog." The message was short but clear. The writer described a journey to a land where grapes grow beneath pale skies, and spoke of sharing this discovery with priests from Rome who had come to the north in friendship. He wrote that they traded stories and promises, that they agreed to send word to the Pope himself. The letter ends with a single sentence that chills the reader even now. "We told them of the far shore, and they asked us not to tell again." Carbon dating placed the birch bark around the year 1030, during the height of Norse exploration. Its combination of runes and Latin proved that at least one meeting between Vikings and emissaries of Rome had taken place. The finding was undeniable, yet when the discovery reached the Vatican's Department of Historical Studies, the official response was silence. The research team was thanked for their work, the birch bark was sent to Rome for conservation, and all public discussion stopped. Months later, the lead archaeologist received a short letter stating that the artifact had been reclassified for preservation. No photographs, no scans, and no translations were released. But copies of the runes had already been made. Linguists in Reykjavik confirmed the message was authentic and remarkably poetic. The phrase "beyond the fog" referred to sailing west, and brothers of both books appeared again, echoing the letter from the Norse abbot centuries before. The glacier had spoken, and its words matched every hidden trace buried in the archives. It confirmed that the North had told Rome about the new lands, and Rome had chosen to bury the truth under centuries of doctrine. The birch bark was more than a message, it was a confession. Its runes formed a pattern shaped like a compass, its centre marked with a cross. It represented union, not opposition, the merging of faith and exploration, knowledge and wonder. The Vatican may have hidden it away again, but the discovery could not be unseen. The truth was like the pole star, always there, unmoving, guiding those who dared to look up through the clouds. The clouds, as the writer said, were official. They passed over and changed shape with each new age, but the light behind them never moved. When the ice finally spoke, it did not accuse or condemn. It simply reminded the world that silence is not absence, that memory waits beneath the frost, and that truth, no matter how long it sleeps, always finds its way back to the Sunday.